opening statement. I want to recognize our ranking member for his opening remarks.
Thank you. You don't have to turn the gavel over, but we are working on it. But I appreciate that very much. I'm also, in the interest of time, going to submit my opening statement for the record. I appreciate our witnesses being here, all their preparation, and the written statements that they've already submitted. Look forward to questions with them.
Thank you. Now I'll introduce our witnesses so they can present their opening statements. I ask each of our witnesses to keep their opening statements to 5 minutes. Your full written statements will be submitted for the record. Our first witness is Kevin McElleen, who previously served as the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security in 2019 and the Commissioner of Customs and Border Protection from 2017 to 2019. Even before this time, he had a long career managing CBP's workforce and leading the organization's operations to secure the U.S. border while expediting lawful trade and travel at 329 ports of entry in the United States and 70 international locations in more than 40 countries. Mr. McElleen, we're honored to have you join us today, and you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member Langford, distinguished members of the committee. It's an honor to appear before you today, to be back in front of HISGAC, especially the newly structured subcommittee with oversight of border management. The topic of this hearing, improving security, trade, and travel at land ports of entry on the southwest border, is a critical one. And it's a privilege to be with such a knowledgeable group, a knowledgeable panel on Southwest border operations. Our ports of entry and land ports in particular have traditionally received less emphasis and focus than they deserve, in my view. Our ports of entry with Mexico are an essential gateway for trade and commerce, integrated manufacturing and supply chains, agriculture, produce, and livestock, and daily connections between shared border communities for work, school, and life. There are also critical points for ensuring the security of the United States, where U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers and agriculture specialists must identify and interdict dangerous people and goods. The majority of hard narcotics, the methamphetamine and opioids plaguing so many parts of our country, have traditionally been smuggled through these ports of entry. Agriculture pests and diseases that can threaten U.S. producers are encountered daily. Cartels move weapons and hard currency outbound daily as well. And human trafficking, counterfeit products, and trade fraud are constant challenges. Over the past decade, Congress has provided significant resources to CBP for land border ports of entry and enhanced legal authorities to enter into innovative public-private partnerships, and CBP has endeavored to deploy them to continually improve the facilitation of lawful trade and travel while enhancing security. As a result, CBP has made substantial progress in improving operations of ports of entry toward that goal of an increasingly well-managed border, one that efficiently and effectively identifies and interdicts threats while expediting the vast majority of lawful travel and trade. More investment, however, in infrastructure, technology, and personnel is needed to sustain and build on this progress, and that investment can have substantial benefits for the United States economy, impacting all 50 states. Ports of entry are an important economic engine for the U.S. economy. On a typical day, almost $2 billion worth of goods move across our shared border with Mexico. Before COVID, the travel restrictions it entailed, several 100,000 people crossed our border each day through a few dozen crossing points. Our land borders necessarily require a combination of infrastructure to accommodate the physical flow, but also technology and personnel to manage it effectively. I'm going to submit my longer statement for the record in view of the need for time for questions, but I wanted to highlight just a few key points. With regard to technology, non-intrusive inspection now available and being deployed offers the promise of 100% inspection of personally owned vehicles and rail cars and truck conveyances crossing our border. Combined with the ability to integrate that data, platforms to assess the risk and provide results to our CBP officers and ag specialists, the potential for dramatic security improvements is achievable in the coming months and years. Combined with enhanced forensics, investments in intelligence analysis, and investigative partnerships, these technologies provide impressive capabilities and offer significant facilitative benefits as well. But the importance of investments in technology are equaled by the importance of the investments in the people of CBP. Ultimately, each decision on admissibility of a person or a good depends on a CBP officer's insight and knowledge. Adequate staffing is essential. The Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Terrorism Events at University of Southern California has found the economic impact to be dramatic. Due to increased efficiency of processing trade and travel, each additional CBP officer contributes over $350,000 to the U.S. economy and supports the growth of 3.5 American jobs. Hiring additional officers pays for itself. The other key point is the infrastructure. We've worked across multiple administrations with CBP has, to prioritize key ports of entry. Those investments are needed now, but also innovative partnerships, public-private, state and local government partnerships like the Cross-Border Express in Southern California, the developing Otay Mesa Port of Entry, and Gordie Howe Bridge on the northern border are great examples of how public-private partnership can speed growth and provide that infrastructure that's critical for that cross-border movement. I'll close now by just noting that by definition, border management is binational, and the partnership with Mexico in this space is critical. We've got great programs like the Unified Cargo Processing Program, but we need more. It needs to be a priority of our diplomatic relationship with the government of Mexico. Thanks again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to engaging the committee's questions.
Well, thank you. Our second witness today is Tony Reardon, the National President of the National Treasury Employees Union. NTEU is the nation's largest independent union of federal employees, and Mr. Reardon has more than 25 years with the union. Thank you so much for your work and for joining us today, and you're recognized for your opening statement.
Okay, Chairwoman Sinema, Ranking Member Langford, and members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to testify on behalf of over 29,000 frontline customs and border protection officers, agriculture specialists, and trade enforcement specialists and support staff at the nation's 328 air, sea, and land ports of entry and at pre-clearance operations overseas. As you know, the ports are an economic driver of the U.S. economy, contributing $74 billion in 2020 revenue collections. The dedicated men and women that NTEU represents ensure the efficient processing of legitimate trade, travel, and they stop illicit trafficking of people, drugs, weapons, and money at ports of entry. Improving security, trade, and travel, and ensuring the safest possible working environment for CBP personnel at all ports of entry, including the Southwest border ports, is incredibly important to our members, especially during the COVID-19 crisis. To date, the CBP frontline workforce has had over 8,800 confirmed COVID-19 cases, and sadly, 32 line-of-duty deaths due to the virus. NTEU mourns these losses with the family, friends, and colleagues of these workers and greatly appreciates their service to our country. Since the vaccine became available, NTEU worked with CBP to encourage and assist our members in getting the vaccine, and that work continues. As I've testified in the past, there is no greater roadblock to border security than the lack of sufficient staff at the ports. Despite the decrease in trade and travel volume due to the pandemic, according to CBP's own staffing models, there is a staffing shortage of 1,700 CBP officers, 400 CBP agriculture specialists, and 200 CBP non-uniform trade specialists. Understaffed ports lead to long delays in travel and cargo lanes, a situation that continues to plague many Southwest border ports. This has led to temporary duty assignments to ensure proper staffing, including at the San Ysidro and Otay Mesa ports of entry, that are currently experiencing up to 4-hour delays. And this situation will only be exacerbated as the temporary bans on non-essential travel are lifted as the spread of COVID-19 diminishes. In addition, the reduction of user fees collected due to the drastic drop in international commercial travel, and to a lesser extent, trade volume since March 2020, also threatens to disrupt CBP staffing at the ports. These user fees fund 40% of CBP personnel, including 8,000 CBP officer positions. And that is roughly 1/3 of the entire CBP workforce at the ports of entry. Without additional funding to support these CBP officers between now and the end of FY 2022, this loss of user fee funding could result in furloughs at a time when this workforce is most needed to facilitate the flow of legitimate travel and trade as the economy recovers. Even though they are severely understaffed, the results of CBP officers' efforts are indisputable. For example, a CBP official recently testified before the House Appropriations Committee that seizures of fentanyl at the ports of entry are up over 300%. It is vital that Congress continue to authorize and fund additional staffing to ensure CBP officers can continue to succeed in this important work. But I want to be clear, NTEU strongly supports border security, and that's why we have fought for many, many years for additional funding to increase CBP staffing at the ports. We fought for better equipment, pay, and benefits for all CBP employees. And all of these things contribute to a strong and secure border and improved trade and travel at the Southwest border ports. After years of effort and much appreciated funding support by Congress, NTEU urges you to ensure that CBP does not lose staffing advances that they finally started to gain, and that CBP personnel at the ports are on the job during the economic recovery. Thank you all very much for having me, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much. Our next witness is Sam Vale, president of the Star Camargo Bridge Company, which operates the bridge connecting the Rio Grande Valley in Texas with the Mexican state of Tamaulipas. I think I said that right. He's joining us today representing the Border Trade Alliance, a nonprofit organization that seeks to address key issues affecting trade, travel, and security at the U.S. northern and southwest borders. Mr. Vale, thanks so much for joining us today. You are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Sinema, and welcome to Member Langford, Ranking Member Langford. I really appreciate the work that all of you are doing. I think that the Border Trade Alliance has for 35 years been promoting good policies for cross-border trade and commerce to benefit the countries of North America. I think that one of the things that I do want to bring up is the definitions that we are using as countries, essential, non-essential. People act like an essential traveler goes back to a community in Mexico that is only essential people. So they're mixing with all the non-essential people. And in the meantime, the border communities are being devastated economically. The local governments are suffering. CBP is suffering. So we're having a lot of reasons why we're looking forward to some of the benchmarks that Senator Sinema is established or mentioned in a letter on March 28th of 21. We're looking forward to working with her on that and the rest of the bipartisan members that signed on to the correspondence. We think that it's truly a shame that we don't really understand how things work on the business and commerce in the border. We think that with the help of the Senate and the House and the administration and our counterparts in Mexico and Canada, that we can come up with a very respectable plan that allows for us to return to more normal activities. Certainly, none of us want CBP to have problems, but we go a long way along the southern border to protect CBP, down to and even testing Mexican officers who are on the U.S. side for the unified cargo processing. So even though CBP can't do that, we did it with our bridge owners. So that's how we try to contribute. We're also talking quite a bit about how we're going to go about being able to come back to normality. The fact that Rice University has demonstrated that $4.9 billion of GDP have been lost solely on the Texas counties on the Mexican border. And I know that it's true for New Mexico, Arizona, and California, and probably up on the northern border as well. We need to get business going again, and that's something that we have an obligation to all of our constituents. I'm looking forward to being able to discuss the the resources that we need. We are big supporters of public-private partnerships. We are currently providing internships. And when I say we, we're talking about the owners of the ports of entry. Internships, we're providing donated properties to the government. We are providing reimbursable services for overtime hours. We're really going all we can to promote the livelihoods of all of the countries in the North America because of trying to put back into the system, even though we're paying taxes just like everybody else. We're looking forward to technology, and as mentioned by Mr. McLenna, we need the technology in order to be successful, and we can absolutely examine 100% of the northbound and southbound cargo with using modern technology. I think that is one of the keys that we need to utilize. We appreciate the opportunity to represent our positions. They're all in the written testimony, and look forward to any discussions and answering any questions that the senators may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Our final witness today is Memo Valencia, who is the president and co-owner of the Arizona-based company Valencia International. He's joining us today on behalf of the Greater Nogales-Santa Cruz County Port Authority. Mr. Valencia, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm looking forward to hearing your Arizona perspective, and you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairwoman Cinema and Ranking Member Langford. Thank you very much for this opportunity. My name is Guillermo Valencia, and I'm past chairman of the Greater Nogales and Santa Cruz County Port Authority. My day job, I'm president and co-owner of Valencia International, a customs brokerage and logistics services company. We've been in business for 40 years. The Port Authority is comprised of the City of Nogales, Santa Cruz County, the Fresh Produce Association of the Americas, the Nogales Customs Brokers Association, Index Nogales, Nogales Community Development, Economic Development Corporation, and the Santa Cruz County Mining Cluster. Our principal focus is the improvement of our ports of entry system and the quality of life of our residents. I would like to bring to your attention the needs of our community. The first issue is our border infrastructure, including our ports of entry and the connectivity to our federal highway system. While we have a state-of-the-art facility at the Mariposa Port of Entry, we also have one of the most outdated, overburdened, and literally crumbling ports in the nation, and that's the DeConcini Port of Entry. In terms of our transportation infrastructure, we work extensively with ADOT, and we are about to complete a $134 million modernization of State Route 189 that connects our commercial port of entry to the Interstate 19. But that is only one aspect of the transportation investments we need. Modernizations are desperately needed at Ruby Road and Rio Rico interchanges on Interstate 19. Our mining, manufacturing, and fresh produce sectors could greatly benefit from a multimodal facility at Rio Rico, but there is simply no funding for this to happen. Multimodal alternatives are essential if we are to remain competitive as a region and a nation. We also need additional CBP staffing at our ports. While staffing has improved in recent years, we still see a situation in which CBP is unable to open every lane during our peak hours and peak operations, and port directors are forced to play a game of opening and closing of different aspects of the ports in order to help maximize operations. They are doing their best with what they have, but that is simply not a standard for our nation's security. Staffing needs to be a thoughtful and deliberative process that meets not only immediate, but future needs. I would also propose that in order to eliminate the constant battle of funding for efforts at the ports of entry versus the space between them, the Department of Homeland Security be modified to create directorates that are highly specialized. While those of you in the committee know the difference, not every member of the Senate or the House of Representatives understands the difference between the Office of Field Operations and the Border Patrol, both commonly and at times erroneously referred to as Customs and Border Patrol. It is important that the customs functions be kept separate than those of the Border Patrol. Too often we hear that the funding was provided to CBP when it was to the Border Patrol and not to the OFO at the ports of entry. Our ports are the trade and tourism lifeline of our nation. Border Patrol does law enforcement between the ports of entry. Their training of the officers and the laws they enforce are very different and not easily interchangeable. Thus, I propose this structure to be better defined. Finally, I implore you to work with the White House in lifting border crossing restrictions for non-essential travel. While these measures may have served an important role at critical times during the height of the pandemic, the continuation of these provisions are engendering the negative impacts on border economies. Border crossing travel here in Nogales is down by over 46%. And that has decimated our small businesses, our restaurants, our hotels, our stores. Santa Cruz County and other local partners have done an exceptional job. And as of the latest reports, more than 82% of eligible population in Santa Cruz County has been fully vaccinated. Our hospitalization rates have decreased dramatically, and positivity rates in our county and on the Mexican side have decreased significantly. While we maintain committed to pushing a message of protecting the health of our residents, we must also protect the health of our business community. And just a few days ago, the CDC lowered the travel advisory for Mexico from a level 4 to a level 3, reflecting the improving conditions on the ground combating the pandemic. The conditions have dramatically improved, and we must reopen the border to all travel. I want to thank you for taking the time to convene this hearing and for your personal commitment to make a difference for the border. We are the front line of our nation's security, but we are also the principal gateway for trade and tourism. Thank you, and I'm happy to address any questions you may have.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Valencia. Now we'll begin the question portion of our hearing, and each senator will receive 7 minutes for questions. I'll recognize myself first for 7 minutes. So I want to start today with both Mr. Valle and Mr. Valencia. From a trade perspective, what are the chief investments or policy changes needed to ensure that our ports effectively serve businesses and border communities? I want to better understand what could have been done during the pandemic, what needs to happen now that we're coming out of the pandemic, and what we need to tackle moving forward.
You want a reply to that?
If possible, yes. Thank you, Mr. Valle.
Yes. I think that we were all rattled by this pandemic, and I think that we did not really measure correctly how it was affecting the border on both sides, including the personnel that the governments support. I think that we could have done much better the minute vaccinations were out, every customs officer should have been vaccinated. I don't know why. All of our employees were vaccinated. Everybody we dealt with, we wouldn't let anybody that came to our business not be vaccinated. So we promoted it. We think that the government could have done a better job there. We're also very concerned about the lack of support that really goes into what the mission of CBP is. Kevin McLean, I think I last saw you in Mexico City, and we were trying to promote good common business practices between both customs and Mexican SOT, as well as the private sector. Senator, I think that the biggest problem that we've got is that we're looking at it always from a rear view mirror point of view, and we're not reaching out in advance and being able to provide for what we need. The private sector is willing to do its part. We've demonstrated that by being able to pay for customs officers. We've now got programs getting interns from college to go into the CBP Ag specialist positions. And when they graduate from college, they're automatically given a job by CBP should they want it. We need to have more of these. There's communities that donate huge tracts of property, build facilities, do all sorts of things to assist the ports of entry. We think that that mission has not been accepted by the country, and it cannot always be just another tax dollar.
Thank you. And Mr. Valencia?
Sure, thank you, Senator Sinema. I'm not an expert on health, and I think most of us didn't know what to expect from this pandemic. So it was kind of hard, and most of us erred on the side of caution. So from that point, I think we understand some of the reactions. But also, the restrictions on travel and essential travel, the definitions on them, and the application of those definitions were, I think, a little bit, how can I say, they were unbalanced. If people traveled by air, they could get into the U.S., but if, you know, they weren't asked many questions. But if they traveled by car, they were asked a lot of questions and they were returned most of the time, right? And mainly for the same, traveling for the same reasons, to conduct business or essential medical necessities or whatever. So I think from that point, we could have all done a better job. Like Mr. Vale said, we, the business sector, adapted really quickly, but the government sector didn't, you know, and I think that's what we can learn from the pandemic is how do we help to adapt quicker in a situation like this where it doesn't hurt us and devastate our local economies the way it did. Was there another part to your question too on the first part of that?
No, that was great. Thank you so much. I'll move now to Mr. McAleen. I want to focus on technology with you. At times, the border security technology discussion focuses too much on the regions between ports of entry and not enough on the ports themselves. Yet we know that criminal networks are constantly targeting our ports. What steps should Congress and DHS take right now to ensure that our strategies and technology investments keep pace with criminals who are continually adapting their tactics in response to U.S. capabilities?
Sure. I guess I'll start and just focus on the highest risk threat coming through the ports of entry in terms of the impact on American lives, and that's those hard narcotics. Mr. Reardon mentioned the 300% increase in fentanyl, talking synthetic opioids and methamphetamine. Really important investment in 2019 from Congress, $600 million for large-scale non-intrusive inspection systems, and importantly, multi-energy systems, which allow truck drivers to stay in the truck while the rear of the conveyance is scanned, and additional low-energy systems that help for personally owned vehicles as they cross the border. That's allowed CBP to substantially initiate the deployment that will take them from only 16% of trucks being scanned to over 70%, and from only 1.6% of personally owned vehicles being scanned to 40%. That's going to be really disruptive to cartel business operations. It's going to increase the security and the potential to make those seizures. But there's more to be done. We're not at 100%. One, that's the obvious conclusion. But also the systems behind the actual non-intrusive inspection that do the analytics that connect the officers to that information coming from the system that allow them to make good decisions on which vehicles they need to further inspect. I think there are real opportunities to invest there. There's also the major issue of the outbound side. We don't have the infrastructure on the outbound lanes to do full-scale inspections at many ports of entry. The newer ports do have some infrastructure, but this is another area where technology, the pace of technology, the portability of these systems allow for scanning to be done outbound as well. The challenge is the cartels outnumber CBP. They have very aggressive spotter networks. So once you go out to the outbound lanes and start doing an operation, they can adjust their practices and stop outbound shipments at that time. Using a scanning system that can be kept there for days at a time, that's what will help disrupt those outbound flow of weapons and currency as well.
Thank you. I see that my time is expiring, so I'll save my questions for Mr. Reardon for our next round. Ranking Member Langford has indicated that he'll defer to the end of the first round of questions. So now I'll recognize Senator Hawley for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks to all of the witnesses for being here today. Mr. McAleen, I'd like to start with you if I could. And I want to talk about CBP's role in enforcing Section 307 of the Tariff Act, if we could. As you know, that section bans the importation of goods that are made with forced labor or made with child labor, and it has for almost a century now, dates back to 1930. My own views, these bans are very critical to protect American workers and also to strengthen accountability for products that come from places that use slave labor. So can I just get your assessment about the process for issuing the withhold release orders? How is that working right now in your view and given your experience?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. A really important aspect of CBP's mission, and one that I was privileged to work on during my tenure as Deputy Commissioner and then Commissioner, when it became a renewed focus, given the fact that one, it's a humanitarian issue in many countries around the world, but two, it absolutely has negative trade impacts as producers are able to use forced labor to undercut pricing in the United States. In terms of the process for withhold release orders, I'll be honest and admit that we had some learning experiences. We issued some withhold release orders without the proper coordination with State Department, with Department of Defense and other parts of government in the initial months and years. But I think CBP has really streamlined those efforts. In fact, there's a CBP trade team up for a Service to America medal for their forced labor work. Not only how comprehensive it is, but the pace of withhold release orders and the coordination in advance across government and with industry. So I think it's improved significantly over time, but I think it's really important that you're highlighting that mission.
Let me ask you about some of the challenges that CBP faces and has faced historically when there is an investigation to be done. I mean, to determine whether or not forced labor exists in a supply chain. Talk us through that a little bit. I mean, when you get an allegation, get a petition for review of potential forced labor, CBP does the investigation. What are sometimes the obstacles, the difficulties that CBP faces in doing that?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, you're trying to work to understand a supply chain in a foreign country where you might not have collaboration from the foreign partner and their authorities. I think that's a fundamental issue. That's why you have to work very closely with State Department. That's why you have to work with Department of Labor, but also the trade supply chain participants. Often it's the good suppliers, the good customs brokers who understand what the prices are supposed to look like, what the natural movement of a particular commodity is supposed to look like through the supply chain. And when that's diverted from, they can point out and offer tips for further review. You also need an investigative and an intel presence. I used to talk with my intel colleagues about, hey, if we could borrow 0.25% of your intelligence power to look into this manufacturer, that would be a huge advantage. But it often comes down to having a liaison in country working out of that embassy that has the trust of the host nation authorities and can go out and look at a factory. And one of the levers we have there is the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. The fact that so many foreign manufacturers want to be part of that because of the benefits, that we do get access to a lot of the legitimate supply chain, which helps you focus on the illegitimate. But it's hard, and more resources are needed for that foreign investigation piece.
That actually anticipated my question there. So if you were to say, if we were to look at trying to give CBP the resources it needs to better conduct these investigations in the WRO process, is the piece about the foreign investigations, is that the critical piece?
That's a key part of it, but I think it's also the CTPAT program and the partnership with the legitimate supply chains to help identify what's outside of that range. I think the CBP Office of International Trade has a strategy for expanding their forced labor impact and the enforcement of Section 307. So I defer to them on their latest needs, but I think you're highlighting an important piece. The intelligence, the investigative piece foreign is really critical.
Let me ask you about the reasonable care standard. Under the Tariff Act, importers of goods are supposed to exercise reasonable care and take the necessary steps to make sure that merchandise that they're importing into the country does not run afoul, of course, of any U.S. laws and does not rely on abused forced labor. I'm just curious about, in your experience, do American companies who are importing goods into the U.S. exercise appropriately that reasonable care that the statute requires? Or in your experience, do we sometimes get sort of a blind eye turned towards forced labor in the supply chain?
So I think broadly speaking, I think it's over 55% of trade to the U.S. by volume are members of CTPAT. We have a very active customs brokers partnership and multiple organizations that really try to ensure the highest level of professionalization and review of those types of issues. So I think the majority of goods coming into the U.S. And the players involved in that are definitely meeting that reasonable care standard. There are unscrupulous players, and there are companies that intentionally evade trade laws and disappear overnight as soon as they start to be investigated. That becomes, again, a resource challenge. HSI has a variety of missions that they need to partner with CBP on. And this is an area where it could use some additional attention over time.
Yeah, very good. I want to come back to the point that you sort of referred to obliquely a minute ago. You talked about the increased effort to enforce this portion of the law, the Section 307 enforcement, which is true. And we had a 15-year stretch, if I've got my facts right, between 2000 and 2015, I think, where there were 0 WROs issued, zilch. Those numbers began to go up under the Trump administration, but last September, even the Department of Labor identified 155 goods from 77 countries that it had reason to believe are produced by forced labor, but we only have about 50 active WROs, which is, pretty telling. There's quite a delta there. In your view, what needs to happen to boost investigation of forced labor imports and increase the issuance of WROs? I mean, give us an overview of what you think Congress can do to help this process.
So what I see is an acceleration of the efforts to address this issue. Really, it was pressure and a spotlight from the U.S. Senate on that lack of withhold release orders that got CBP to generate a focus in their Office of International Trade on this issue. They now have developed the mechanisms, the muscle memory, if you will, between the Office of Trade and the other components, the Office of Counsel, that have to issue these orders. And 0 to 50 is not 0 to 100 yet in terms of speed, but they're definitely accelerating dramatically. And I think that Department of Labor report is a good anchor to show the scale of the problem and how much more needs to be done.
Very good. My time's expired. Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. I now turn 7 minutes over to questions for Ranking Member Langford. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank all 4 of you for the testimony today and what you're bringing to the conversation, and as well as your written testimony. Mr. Rudin, I want to ask you, what are the major barriers we have to hiring additional CBP personnel?
Thank you, Senator. I forgot to unmute myself. I think probably the one of the main barriers is that I've said for years and years that the current CBP officers, and this actually even goes beyond just the officers to other employees, I think CBP employees should be the best recruiters for the agency. And unfortunately, the morale for many years has been very low. And some of that relates back to what you've heard me talking about in my opening statements and my written statement about staffing. There are so few staffs, so much fewer than are needed. And as a result, many employees have to work a great deal of overtime. And it impacts their personal well-being, it impacts their families, and creates real hardships on them. So, and as a result, the morale's low, and they are not the best recruiters. I think we have started to see CBP has done a much better job of actually going out and recruiting folks and starting to bring them in. And certainly there's been some funding that has assisted in that process from Congress. So we thank you obviously for that. But from my perspective, and I think this question probably is really well suited for CBP, but I think from my perspective, if we can start finding a way to really improve the morale, get more staffing in there, we're going to start seeing some real improvement.
Were you surprised at President Biden's budget flatlined all of DHS and flatlined hiring, that it did not extend new hiring in CBP?
Well, what I will say, and I think I said in my longer statement, is that we believe that more staffing is needed, and I certainly hope that Congress will provide more money to CBP, more funding to CBP. I think the last thing that is needed is a situation where we have to look at furloughs for employees, especially at a time where we're looking, Senator, at the economy rebounding and travel is going to start really increasing. That would be a problem. The TDYs that CBP employees are having to endure, and they've had to do it now for several years, and it's happening again right now, and it will only increase, I believe, in the summer. Those have a very significantly negative impact on the folks that are not only having to travel down to do the TDY, but also they're leaving a port of entry, and that has a negative impact on the staffing in that port as well.
Right, I would assume so, for that significantly. Thank you for that. Mr. McAlean, I need to ask you a little bit about what we've talked about several times, and that's about hard narcotics coming into the United States. I'm in Oklahoma, unlike Arizona. I'm not a border state, but what happens at the border certainly affects us. We have the flow of narcotics that are coming into our state as well. And as you mentioned already, just fentanyl has increased by 3 times just over the last year. So while COVID time, we've seen a decrease in a lot of movement. The exception to that has been fentanyl coming into the country and being interdicted. We've seen a dramatic increase in that. You talked a lot about additional technology and getting to the point where we can do 100% non-intrusive evaluations of the border of vehicles and pedestrians. What kind of time period and what is needed to be able to achieve that? Does the technology exist, or do you need additional new technology, additional deployment of that?
Can I give you 30 seconds on your last question as well?
Sure.
So just really quickly, I agree with Tony's points on supporting the workforce and increasing morale. But CBP's actually done quite a bit with the workload staffing model, with recruiting, with shortening the time to hire by 70%. What I think is needed next is really a replacement of the fee basis for hiring, which is 1/3 of CBP officers, with more of a TSA style. Fees can reimburse hiring, but we need a consistent appropriation from Congress that meets the workload staffing model, so you can keep that supply chain of officers, that recruiting process going without disruption. So that'd be my structural recommendation on the hiring. And they will need some support from Congress coming out of COVID. In terms of does this technology exist now to really make substantial gains on interdiction of hard narcotics at the ports of entry? Yes, it does. The deployments of the multi-energy portals, of the low energy portals for the personally owned vehicle lanes are already making an impact and increasing the numbers of inspection. And as you heard Tony mention, the fentanyl seizures up 300%. The technology exists. They've got key players on contract to go ahead and keep deploying those systems now. What we need to do is look at what the investments needed and what makes the most sense to get that as close as possible to 100% at the land border, and then to look at the outbound piece. I will note that the border is a chain, and a chain is as strong as its weakest link. You will have security spillover issues between ports of entry. As you're already seeing, opportunistic smugglers go between ports right now with hard narcotics. Which was not happening as much in the past. The majority went through the ports of entry. So that'll be something Congress has to look at holistically.
Obviously, to be able to make changes in technology, adding additional items, additional inspection points and such, that's harder to do at some of the older ports of entry that are more landlocked and that are in urban areas, easier to do in open rural areas. So let me do twofold here. One is that we have a real difference in how the land ports of entries are overseeing the physical areas. Some of those GSA oversees, in fact, most of those do. Some of those CBP actually runs their own in more rural areas, especially along the Canadian border. How do we resolve this? Because when I talk to folks at CBP, I often hear the issue of, I'd like to make changes, but it's 7 years to be able to make a change when we go through GSA and all sorts of edits, and it takes forever to be able to get there. How do we fix that process so obvious problems on the ground can get fixed and CBP can actually not only just make the request, but actually get it executed?
Great question. It's an extraordinarily complex bureaucratic process, both on the U.S. government side, at the federal level, working with state and locals, and with that critical binational coordination with Mexico. 2 things that I've seen have worked is a joint prioritization between CBP and GSA of which ports of entry require investment and improvement at the national level annually. That's important. Doing the same with Mexico, equally important. But I do think we need to shorten the number of steps needed to make a significant infrastructure change. The process of a presidential permit with the Department of State is another cumbersome layer, an appropriate review. But all these things, I think, should face tighter timelines and more of a teamwork and coordinated effort to get done. In terms of the day-to-day management of ports of entry at the border, that's another challenge. We have a mixed real estate oversight. CBP owns a significant number of the smaller ports of entry, especially those funded in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, while GSA leases back to CBP and manages some of the larger ports of entry that have the majority of traffic on the southwest border. That creates a cumbersome process for prioritizing fixes and improvements, and I think can be done better, honestly, at the federal, national level, but also at the regional and local level.
I would agree it could be done better. I do see the layers of bureaucracy and the challenges that are there. That CBP has got to set their priorities. They go through their own studies, set priorities. Then it goes to GSA. They go through years of study on a second set of priorities. Then it's got to give with State Department. It's got to give with the White House with OMB. That's years in process just to be able to study and evaluate what is obvious needs to be done. And you typically say it needs to be done when it needs to be done, not 7 years in advance of when it needs to be done. So we've got to find a way to be able to get that resolved, and that's one of the things our subcommittee is working on right now. So any insight that we can get, I'd be glad to be able to get. And I see I've run a little bit over time on that. I yield back.
Thanks so much, Ranking Member Langford. Mr. Reardon, I would like to follow up with you. In Arizona and the other border states, we've had a recurring problem of understaffing in some of our ports. Now, CBP reports that numbers in ports such as Nogales have been better recently, but I always worry about retention. Given that we remain in the midst of a pandemic and that securing our ports remains a challenging and difficult job, what steps does Congress need to take in order to improve morale and employee retention?
Well, Chairwoman Sinema, thank you for that question. I think one of the things that certainly could be done is to support the introduction and passage of the DHS Morale Act. I think that would probably play a pretty significant role. One of the things that it does is it authorizes the establishment of an employee engagement steering committee comprised of representatives from across the department, as well as individuals from employee labor organizations. So I think it would provide an opportunity for some feedback and starting to learn some of the issues that might help in terms of morale. I think also it would help in terms of directing. The bill would direct the Chief Human Capital Officer to analyze government-wide federal workforce satisfaction surveys. So I think what's ultimately important here is to start really having a dialogue with and understanding what's going on with frontline employees. What are the touch points that are needed in order to improve the morale? But I want to underscore, because I think it's critically important. And I keep going back to the staffing, because I will tell you, when I talk to folks, what is abundantly clear to me is at the center of all of the morale issues and really a lot of the major issues as far as frontline employees are concerned, it's related to staffing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'd like to ask another question to Mr. McElleen. As you mentioned previously, non-intrusive inspection is a critical technology solution at our ports of entry. It helps port officers identify vehicles for further inspection, makes our entire nation more secure. And CBP is working right now to improve NII technology and expand its use. But it works best in conjunction with other efforts, such as canine units and traditional law enforcement intuition. What other technologies and initiatives should Congress and DHS pursue to help ensure that NII technology is as effective as possible?
Yeah, I think it's worth going a layer deeper in that. Take a multi-energy portal, for instance, that's used to scan a large commercial truck coming across the border. The old technology, which was outstanding at the time and a big improvement, the driver would have to get out of the truck before the scan started, because it would be a potential threat to health. And so each truck had to be pulled in, parked, the driver gets out, the scan happens, takes a minute or two to do the scan, and then it's reviewed by an officer. So the new multi-energy systems can go from maybe 7 to 10 trucks an hour to 70. And think about all those images that are going into the officer, because the driver no longer has to get out of the truck. They no longer even have to stop. The vision is that a truck will not have to fully come to a stop at the U.S. border with the advanced information we have on what's in it, and with the X-ray scan and those other tools like canines, like officer intuition and review. So with those images coming in from a much higher capability scanner, you really need an automated image analysis capability that assists the officers and helps them identify things that might present a threat, so they can then make that decision on whether to do a further examination of that vehicle. So you're going to get many more trucks scanned, but ultimately fewer that need to go to secondary inspection, and less pressure on the officers to review all those images. So that's like a next layer of technology that needs to be implemented alongside those purchases of the equipment itself.
Thank you. I've got one more question for Mr. Reardon, and then I will yield time back to Senator Langford if he has another round of questions before we head to the vote. So, Mr. Reardon, at some point, we're going to reopen our ports of entry to non-essential travel. I hope sooner rather than later. And I've joined a bipartisan group of my colleagues in asking DHS for a plan on how to do that safely. From a workforce perspective, what do we need to keep in mind as we return our ports to more regular operations?
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Sinema. Appreciate that question as well. You know, I think one of the things that we've got to pay attention to is we've got to push to get as many people vaccinated as possible. I think that we need to continue to look at social distancing to make sure that, you know, people can remain as safe as they possibly can. But I think also looking at testing, you know, so that we can ensure that if somebody does get ill, that we know about it, and then we can, you know, start looking at who they've been in contact with and do some of that work that early on in the pandemic, you know, it didn't happen. That contact tracing was really walked away from very quickly. And I think that's a problem. But I do believe that it is DHS's responsibility, and ultimately now, since we're talking about CBP, their responsibility to get employees vaccinated. And part of my concern is, as these variants are making their way around the world, we've got to make sure that that part of this plan you're referring to addresses those needs, protecting people from the variants. And because the last thing we need is, for example, at one of the ports in Arizona, or anywhere else for that matter, if a bunch of employees start becoming sick, that can really deplete our ability to manage and protect our country in that particular port of entry.
Thank you. Senator Langford.
Thank you again. Let me run through a series of questions here, and this is going to be more specifically for Kevin and Mr. Reardon. I'll be able to go back and forth through. This is a challenge. It's not normal, but it is a challenge for us to be able to try to process through. So January of this year, Department of Justice announced that they were sentencing a CBP individual, and I'll leave his name out, for 30 months to prison for bribery after he received a $6,000 cash bribe to allow a convicted felon through the Nogales port of entry. Not typical, does happen at times. My question is, what are we doing to be able to continue to accelerate this? Obviously, the cartels have a tremendous amount of cash. They're moving that cash around, and they're constantly trying to be able to reach out to be able to find ways to be able to move illicit materials and individuals across our port. What's the best way to be able to manage that among our employees? Kevin, I'll let you start first.
So I think the most important element is really the investment in the CBP Office of Professional Responsibility. This starts at the hiring and the training with a good background review as someone's coming into the workforce, good periodic reinvestigations, but also having the authority and the resources to follow up on tips that do come in or concerns that are presented. CBP's Office of Professional Responsibility only gained the authority to do their own criminal investigations in 2013. So it's been a developing work in progress. And I think Assistant Commissioner Klein and his team have done a great job in building out a really highly professional workforce. But they've got to combine that effort with the DHS Inspector General and with the FBI Public Corruption Task Forces on the border, their BCTFs, Border Corruption Task Forces, because these are few and far between, but they can be very serious cases. They can expose very serious security risks. And that investment and that oversight and follow through has got to be critical, both for the accountability and security of the American people, but also, for Tony's points, to the morale of the workforce. They want bad apples and individuals that are violating their oath to be taken out of the workforce. And so having that accountability is really important to the overall health of the organization.
Tony, you want to add anything to that?
I would simply say that Kevin is exactly right. In his past life with DHS and CBP, he and I actually had a lot of opportunities to talk about these kinds of things. And one thing I will say about frontline employees, and this extends to their employee representative, in this case NTEU, is that we want employees held accountable as well. It does not do CBP, it does not do employees that are doing the right thing and serving their nation proudly, as the vast majority do. And it certainly doesn't help our country when people are doing what you described was being done by the individual being sentenced to 30 months or whatever it was. So yeah, we think they should be held accountable. And I do want to impress upon everybody on this call, and I think it's already probably well understood, that it is very rare that these kinds of things happen. But when they do, it's important that they are dealt with, in accordance with the law.
I appreciate that very much, and I agree it is rare, but continuing the process to be able to evaluate, to be able to encourage, maintain morale, and to be able to have professional responsibility would be really important. Flip to the other side of the border, my staff has heard from several different sources that the border crossing cards are occasionally collected, used by cartels, that they will hand them out to drivers that have the physical appearance that's similar to what they're seeing on the card, and try to be able to move individuals and contraband through based on a false border crossing card that doesn't line up with the individual that's actually using it at that moment. What can we do to continue to increase the speed of truck traffic and other traffic coming across, but maintain security? Are there things that we could actually implement or processes in place?
Is that?
Go ahead.
No, I was going to ask if that's for Kevin or for me.
That's a yes. It's for both of you if you have a good thought on that.
So very quickly, the arc of this progress on the border has been really impressive over the last 15 years or so, going from really an oral declaration of citizenship to only 7 accepted documents under the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative, going to much more secure documents, going to trusted travelers, programs like Sentry, being able to segment those travelers and have higher confidence in their background. But absolutely more can be done. And I know that CBP is working on incorporating more biometrics and backing up the documents with facial recognition that can be done at speed for pedestrians and those in personally owned vehicles. I think that's a really important augmentation to the security of identity crossing the border.
Anyone have anything to add? Any of the three of you?
And Senator, I would simply add that, whatever the mechanisms are that are put in place, as long as our officers are appropriately trained and on how to use whatever the technology is, they will make use of whatever they are instructed to use.
Okay. Let me add one more question here. And this is for all four of you. If you don't want to answer, you don't have to. If it's redundant, someone else has already said it. But everyone is very committed to moving through legitimate supplies, materials, good trade across our border, both north and south. The Sentry and FAST programs have been essential for that. But again, if there are problems with Sentry and FAST, we've got to identify those to make sure that that doesn't become an area where we have illicit traffic as well. So it's finding a way to be able to protect those programs, continue to be able to strengthen those programs. Information will be important. The technology around it will be important. But any insight that you have to be able to help protect the integrity of those programs to make sure that we can keep it protected and continue to be able to move trade across the border.
Senator, I would say this, that that it is extremely important that you start using the more modern facial technology equipment, because that will help with truck drivers. That helps with all of us 20 years ago might have objected to that. But today we know it's a quicker, faster. I mean, we actually go to airports and pay extra money so they can get our eyeballs on record. So I think that we need to understand that we need to use the most modern technology. The worst thing that can happen to an officer is to be tied to a booth because they don't have enough broadband to be able to move around with tablets and be able to give reports of what they're seeing, what they're observing, and that they don't know who's crossing the border. I mean, that's crazy.
That's very helpful. Anyone else
And
have
Senator?
insight there?
Yeah, and Senator, I'll give you a personal experience that this happened last night at 9 o'clock. I crossed the border into Mexico walking on foot, right? And I came back across and there was minimal line, but there was some people in front of me. And the people that were in front had paper documents and it took forever to get those processed, right? But I came across with my Sentry card and that has a chip and that has all the biometrics in it. And I just went up to the facial recognition and I was through in 10 seconds. So yes, applying more of that technology would help definitely.
Any other insight? Gentlemen, thank you. I appreciate it very much. Madam Chairman, if I can make one quick personal comment on this, Mr. Valencia is a fan of Ansel Adams photography, which I am as well. Those are magnificent pictures behind you, and he does great photography as well. So thanks for your engagement, and thanks for all your written testimony as well as your oral testimony today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Senator Langford. And you should see Ansel Adams' work from Arizona. It's phenomenal. And with that, we've reached the end of today's hearing. I appreciate the witnesses for their time and testimony, and I want to thank my colleagues for your participation. This is an important subject, and I look forward to working with my colleagues to improve security, travel, and trade at all of our ports of entry. Today's hearing record will remain open for 2 weeks until July 1st of 2021. That's when questions for the record are also due. Thanks again, and we're adjourned.